This is a Grow Your Own webinar series in collaboration with the Greater Sudbury Public Library and Sudbury Shared Harvest. My name is Chanel and Kristlyn is behind the camera today, and we work for Sudbury Shared Harvest. So today we're at Ikasagondar Hanmer in the garden that we've been working in all summer. We have a group of 6 students who have really helped this garden flourish. But today we're going to be talking about mosses. So how to grow mosses, what are they, moss graffiti even. So first we'll start off with what is a moss and what does it look like? So here we have some moss growing in a shady area near the fence. So mosses are a non-vascular plant, meaning they don't have roots like most plants do. Some have what they call rhizomes, which are really just like little root hairs that help anchor the plant to the ground. But the moss also doesn't have, so the non-vascular system means there's no system inside of the plant that is helping pull water from the roots and bringing it up to the plant. So that means that it needs to hold on to water in a totally different way than a tree might. So the moss actually holds on to water within its cells. So one moss leaf, which might be like one of these little hairs, is actually covered in cells that just uptake all the water and therefore all the nutrients too for the plant to grow. So here you can see it's very cushiony. They grow really closely to each other, and that's because that helps them hold on to water. So actually mosses hold, I'm not actually sure the percentage, but hold lots of water in the plant itself. So often when you see mosses growing somewhere, it's because that's where water will either puddle naturally and it allows them to grow. But you can see here, there's other little plants here trying to outcompete the moss. So often you'll see grass in a lawn and very few moss because the grass is actually outcompeting the moss. It's taking up the water through its roots, all the nutrients. So mosses are kind of the first thing that you might find, but then other vascular plants might come in and take over. And so also mosses are very opportunistic growers, meaning that they'll grow almost anywhere. So they might not even need soil to grow. They can grow on a rock. That's because they don't have roots. So they're actually just taking up all the nutrients and all the water in their plant body. And so they don't need soil to hold on to or to take up nutrients from. Oh. And so also they might grow in soil like you see here, but it might be because the soil here is very compact, meaning not too many other plants can grow here because the soil is not a super great condition. But the moss can, so it's taking the opportunity to grow here. So today we're going to show you how to grow moss. And basically moss can be grown either by its spores, so it'll spread by spores, kind of like mushrooms do, or transplanting. So right now I'll show you how to transplant moss. Basically want to pick it just like I did. Maybe a bigger clump would be better, but this will be fine for now. And then you'll want to just plant it wherever you want your moss to grow. So maybe in your garden, or we'll show examples that you can grow moss on brick walls or even wood, like old stumps and things like that. One thing I do want to say though, is that it's not very maybe ethical to go into the forest and harvest lots of moss, because then you're taking away from the ecosystem in the forest. So I suggest if you want to grow moss in your garden, look around your yard first. You'll probably find some moss growing on a stump or in the shaded place of your yard. And so it's a lot better just to move that moss around than to go out in the forest and take moss from somewhere else. Also, it means that if you already have moss growing in your yard, that it'll probably grow well in your garden, in your yard, versus if you're going out in the forest where it's super shady, all the nutrients are different, that moss might not grow well in your yard or in your garden. So we're gonna go plant this in the garden. So because moss likes to grow in the shade and it needs a lot of moisture, we're planting this on the north side of our garden where it's going to be covered by lots of shade by these
Jerusalem artichokes.
That grow really tall. They'll die down over the winter, but then they'll come back up like this. So it's providing shade. And also, okay, so what they're doing here, they're just moving the wood chips aside and putting mats of moss into the garden. So these are a few different kinds of moss. We're just gonna see how they go, just for an experiment and to show how, you know, there's lots of different kinds of mosses. So if you go in a forest, you might notice, you know, like 5 different species of mosses that you've never seen before. And so the idea here with transplanting is that the moss is gonna spread over time. Moss is a really slow growing plant, so it might take up to 6 weeks or even a year or 2 until the plant is well established and beginning to spread in your garden. If you wanted to really plant like your full yard with moss, I would suggest having little bits of moss and placing quite a few all around your yard, and then having them grow like mat together, so spaced out, and then they'll grow together eventually instead of grabbing like one big chunk of moss and putting it in. And so they're watering it just to give it that extra moisture right off the bat. But so for the first 6 weeks or so, you're gonna want to keep checking on your moss, make sure that it's staying wet. It's not drying out, because that's probably meaning it's going to die. So this is one way to plant moss into your garden. Another way is called, or what they call on the internet, moss graffiti. So I'll show you what that is over here. So we have Rochelle here who's going to demonstrate how to do moss graffiti. So basically, this mixture that she's painting onto the wooden parts of the sign is a mixture of, let's say, 1 cup of buttermilk, 1 cup of water, blended with some moss, so maybe a handful of moss that you grabbed from your garden. And then also different recipes will suggest adding sugar, water, holding granules, or even beer. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. Also, this method is kind of tricky. It might fail you, it might succeed. So you kind of have to check on it often, because it'll have to stay moist. It'll take a longer time to grow. It might get washed away by heavy rains. So it's a trial and error type of thing. Also, it's hard to get the right mixture. You want the consistency of the paint to be quite similar to paint. But as you can see, this one is very watery. But basically what Rochelle is doing here is trying to get some of the moss pieces onto the wood, and then also, just painting it onto the sign so that eventually the spores will hold and it'll grow moss. So actually the best time to do this is in the spring or the fall, so around this time when temperatures, well, it's still a little hot right now, but when temperatures are cooling down, there's more moisture in the air. It's really ideal to grow and transplant moss. So also you want to make sure that it's not going to rain too heavily in the next few days. So tomorrow is going to be a heavy rain, so it's really just trial and error here, but just to show you guys how to do it. And then if it does wash away, we'll just come back and try it again and then hope for the best. So this is one example to paint moss on wood. So it has to be a porous material so that it can hold water, and maybe the little moss hairs can hold on to whatever you're painting on. So this is also the north side of the sign, so it'll receive shade for most of the day. Hopefully it'll stay cool and humid. But we're also going to show you an example of painting moss on brick. So we're going to go over here. like I said, moss is an opportunity. Wait, I keep trying to say this word. Opportunistic grower. So you can already see here that it's starting to grow in the cracks. We haven't planted this. It's just the moss seeing an opportunity to grow here. And so I thought it'd be a great idea to try to have more moss growing on these bricks. So Rochelle here is going to try to do just like a little design. It's really up to you what you want to do. If you want it to look really nice and have a really pretty design, you might want to use a stencil. So that way you can just slab on the moss onto the stencil and have really nice shapes. And then even then, so let's say this moss sticks to the brick. You're going to want to come back the next day or whenever it's really hot, just give it a nice little spritz of water, keep it moist. And then also you might find that the growing is very sparse and you're not getting full coverage as much as you want. So I would suggest coming back, adding some more moss, like if you really want that design to come out. It is quite a tricky art form, but I thought it's really cool. I'm sure not too many people know about this. I learned about moss graffiti in my restoration course, just the way to grow moss where there aren't any, like on bare rock and things like that. So I just thought it was really cool. One thing I will say is that, so moss holds a lot of water. So if you're growing it on your house, on your brick wall or whatever, it could hold on to lots of water and deteriorate your walls. However, because we're in a pretty dry-ish climate, I don't think that moss will grow crazy like it would in BC, where you have moss naturally growing on houses and people trying really hard to take it off of their roofs. However, if you don't want the moss there anymore, moss is really easy to peel off, just like you saw when I picked some of the moss off the ground. It has no roots, so you could just pick it off. And to make sure that no spores grow, if you don't want them to, you could spray it with a mixture, I think, of like dish soap or of vinegar and water to kill the spores. So it is pretty simple to remove. I don't think it would turn into too big of a problem if you did grow some moss in your house, but obviously that's something to consider. Yeah, so that's how to grow moss graffiti. I hope you guys try it out at home. Are there any questions? Yeah.
There's one question. Do all types of moss grow well together?
Not necessarily. So different mosses will grow in different conditions. So that's the thing about choosing moss out of your yard instead of just randomly in the forest. That will grow, what you already have will grow well in your space likely. Together, some mosses do grow well together, but then also some will outcompete other mosses because they are very prolific. They need a specific type of nutrient and acidity. And if they build up enough, they'll outcompete everything else. So another good thing to note that I forgot is that moss loves acidity. So acidic soils, which we have tons of here. But I think different mosses have different ranges of acidity. So if you pick a moss and you really want the specific type of moss to grow in your yard, I would say search up what it needs nutrient-wise and acidity-wise. Also, a thing I forgot to mention is that if you already have moss in your yard, like we showed you over there, there's some growing naturally, and you want it to grow more, you kind of want to outcompete the grass and things like that, then you could pour a mixture of that buttermilk and water, and that'll help the moss to grow because buttermilk is basically milk and vinegar or an acid like lemon juice. And so that's giving the acidity that the moss needs to grow that might not be there already, and also the nutrients from the milk to help it grow.
Cool. So can you use a spray bottle or the mist setting on the garden hose to keep the moss graffiti moist?
Yeah, I would highly suggest the mist setting, and don't over soak it. Just give it a nice watering once in a while. You don't want it to wash away, so no heavy water pressure or anything like that.
Should you cover your moss graffiti with something to protect it while it's growing?
Yeah, you definitely could. I wouldn't suggest leaving it covered. So kind of like how you would cover your plants from frost, let's say. I would say cover it if you have a really hot day so it can stay humid, maybe I guess with some saran wrap. I'm not too sure. This is just what I'm thinking. It would keep it moist. And also if there's a heavy rain, you can cover it so that it protects it from the rain. So maybe that's a little more difficult on a wall, but let's say you're trying to grow moss on, let's say even just this concrete, you can see like a few plants growing. I would just put a bucket on top if it's going to rain heavily so it doesn't wash away.
Mhm. Okay, I don't see any other questions right now.
Okay, and so just other ideas I want to share is like I've seen really cool things where it's like a statue and they paint moss on it, so you could keep that statue inside if you want to, like those little Buddha heads and that sort of thing. So you have moss growing on these structures, and it's fun because sometimes you have other things growing from the moss that you put, like little ferns and things like that. So it can be quite cool to see how it grows, what grows in it. And so just, I would suggest Googling a bit to see other inspiration pictures. I will also mention that if you do Google pictures of the moss graffiti, often you'll see these big, nice installations or paintings of moss graffiti on a concrete wall or brick wall. Oftentimes they're not doing it with this method because this method is actually quite tricky to get like a nice, perfect shape. Often they might be even taking like mats of moss like we did for the transplant, sticking that onto the wall with some type of glue, I'm not sure. But that's a different method I'm not too familiar with, but I just want to say that like you might see pictures that look a lot greater than what you're gonna get, but I think either way, this is a really cool way to paint organically in a sense. So I hope you guys enjoyed, got some inspiration. Yeah, bye.